Okay, one candidate who consistently does well in straw polls held at this type of conservative event is Congressman Ron Paul, and he's joining us now live from the Values Voters Summit. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. Nice to be with you.
Nice to have you on board again. The nation's unemployment numbers remain very high at 9%, and this week the president took Republicans in Congress took aim at them for blocking his efforts to pass what he calls his jobs bill. He says if it doesn't pass, we could end up with double-dip recession. Is that hyped up threats, or is it true?
Well, it's not true. I don't think we've got out of the recession. I think we have a continuous recession. It's turning into a depression, and I don't think it will do any good because until we recognize how we have financial bubbles and why they must burst and why we have to have a correction, we can't solve our problem. And that deals with the monetary system and the spending and the huge amount of debt. Unless you liquidate debt and malinvestment, you can't have economic growth again. And so far, I haven't heard any serious proposal other than coming from our campaign on how you should and proceed with the liquidation of debt so we can get back to economic growth.
Well, are there parts of the president's bill that you can support?
Well, I haven't looked at it in every single detail, but it looks like what he wants to do is spend money. My problem is that our problem is debt. If a family is deeply in debt, you don't tell them to spend more money and all of a sudden things are going to be okay. What we're doing right now is the free market is challenging the Keynesian model on economic policy. Keynesians say that we're in a recession because the people won't spend their money. But they don't have jobs, they don't have any money, and deeply in debt. This whole idea that if the government just prints money and passes it out, and people are going to spend more money, it's a flawed philosophy. And therefore, until we recognize this, we can't expect recovery. We have to not deal with a debt problem with accumulation of more debt and more inflation.
You know, we've been reporting at the top of our show, as you just heard, about the fighting that's going on between the two perceived frontrunners in this race over Mitt Romney's faith. As a Christian, do you think Mormon is part of a cult, as high-profile Key Perry supporter Pastor Jeffers put it?
No, no way.
What do you think of the remarks that were made?
Well, I just disagree with them, and I don't know why people make remarks like that. It just looks like they don't want to deal in philosophy, and they want to deal with words and trying to be negative in the way they make these charges. So I think it's unnecessary, since I don't believe it's true. I think we should be talking about unemployment. I think we should be talking about our foreign policy. I think we should be talking about our Federal Reserve System and dealing with the issues that government are supposed to be dealing with. I mean, this whole idea that the most important thing between two candidates right now is the definition of cult and trying to make it sound negative to one for one person to get the edge over another. I think that, and they are encouraged, of course, by others to keep this thing going, but I don't think that's the issue of the day. I think liberty is the issue of the day, our Constitution is the issue of the day, and too much government. That is the issue of the day. It's not the definition of a cult.
You know, you've been doing well in straw polls in the past. Where do you expect to come out in the Value Voters straw poll this weekend?
I expect to do well, but I have no idea. I don't do head counts. All I do is deliver a message that I've been delivering for 35 years, and I was very pleased that it was well received today. So I felt good. A lot of times I'm very, very critical of myself because I see my flaws. But today I actually felt pretty good about the reception that I got.
We begin with a Fox News election alert. Ron Paul is the big winner in today's Values Voters Summit straw poll in Washington.
Big surprise here is that Ron Paul, the libertarian, the live and let live libertarian, comes out on top among a group of very, very socially conservative Republicans. Here are the results right now. Ron Paul, 37%. Kaine, 23%. Rick Santorum, 16%. Perry, only 8%, tied with Bachmann at 8%. Romney, only 4%. Gingrich, 3%. Huntsman, 0%. Undecided got more than Huntsman. Undecided, 1%. Asked about this surprise Paul win, Tony Perkins, who is the head of the Family Research Council, said that he couldn't really explain it. He said that this is basically a testing ground. He also added there were a lot of young people here. I saw that firsthand because at the same time Mitt Romney was speaking on the podium in the auditorium here. Ron Paul was having a meet and greet, and the line to meet him, and mostly young people, extended literally hundreds upon the hundreds of people. Paul also tried to tie his libertarianism to the teachings of Jesus Christ and of the Bible. In fact, he quoted one biblical passage from the book of Samuel, I believe it was chapter 1, verse 8, where he warned, Samuel does, about the danger of kings. Here's Ron Paul.
In Samuel, although he knew he wasn't going to be around long, he advised the people of Israel not to accept the king, because the king, he warned, would not be generous. It would undermine their liberties. There would be more wars. There would be more taxes.
And Paul went on to say that the governing body that most matters in everybody's life is their family. And he said that we in Washington have been paying way too much attention to the king as of late. That line got a lot of applause in this auditorium, Heather.
This was a shocking and in some ways interesting week for presidential politics. Congressman Ron Paul won the Value Voters straw poll. Governor Rick Perry flubbed another debate. New Jersey Governor Chris Christie endorsed former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney. Businessman Herman Cain jumped ahead in the polls among the Republican presidential candidates and actually attacked President Obama, saying the president's never been part of the black experience in America. A lot to talk about. Here with his insights on these political stories and what we can expect in the coming week, my colleague and friend, Fox News contributor Juan Williams. Juan, it's a pleasure. As always, welcome here. Ron Paul winning the Value Voters straw poll. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I always associated the Value Voters with the strong social conservatives. We will use the government to bend your morality to our views, sort of the Rick Perry type, rather than the Ron Paul leave me alone type. What's your make on that?
Well, two things. One is a lot of young people turned out for the Value Voter Summit here in D.C., and of course, they are right now sort of at the base of that kind of activism. And I think you're going to see a lot of libertarian expressions of leave me alone come out now in the Republican Party as a result. The reason I say that is normally the social conservatives are not necessarily lining up with Ron Paul in every example. But remember, Ron Paul is the father of the Tea Party, right, and his influence is growing. And you don't pick it up in a lot of the media, Judge. But the fact is, he won this thing. He's not getting the kind of money that Mitt Romney's getting. He's not getting the Chris Christie endorsement that you just spoke about. But if you look at the votes, he's consistently performing right now, and the Value Voter Summit's a prime example of it.
Well, I'm certainly running against people like Chris Dodd and Barney Frank. I think the House Republicans ought to repeal the Dodd-Frank bill next week. I think it's a terrible bill. I think Michelle Bachmann had it exactly right. It is a job-killing, homeowner killing, small bank killing, small business killing bill. They ought to repeal it, send it to the Senate, and we ought to build pressure on the Senate to repeal it. The fact is that the Congress and the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury, I mean, I suggested tonight Bernanke ought to be fired, Geithner ought to be fired. If people are mad about the current economy, the right place to focus is Washington, because Washington is a destroyer of jobs in this country. Worse under Obama, but the general underlying bureaucracy, the general underlying regulatory pattern has been building for a long time, and it is killing jobs in America.
All right, here's a random question. Any of your the other candidates say tonight that surprised you?
There was a lot of very interesting conversation, candidly, and I think that whether it was Rick Santorum was a very good proposal on manufacturing. Herman Cain, who is endlessly funny, and I didn't really realize, I knew it, but I had forgotten the implication, that he had served in the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, was on the board in the 1990s. Both a sign of how much he knows, but also a sign that he and Ron Paul are going to have some really interesting conversations about the Federal Reserve System. And of course, Ron Paul was very happy tonight to have all the conversation about Bernanke and the Federal Reserve and the need to audit the Federal Reserve, which is an issue he's been pioneering for, I guess, 30 years now.
What 999 does is he compromises in the worst way. He gives you a sales tax and a flat tax and opens up the door to a value-added tax. I think it's very, very dangerous. And the way I see it, I don't think that it's going to tax those who have bigger incomes. it's going to tax, it's a regressive tax. People who are going to get a 9% sales tax and they don't even have jobs right now. So I think because it's so regressive, that's going to, if we ever came close to it, it'd be very, very unpopular. And matter of fact, I think the more people know about it, the more questions will be asked. What does he believe in? I mean, if he believes in a value-added tax and a sales tax and flat tax and all these things, that to me is very important. What worries me is he's had a lot of political experience because he's been in the Federal Reserve System. And you can't do that without being very political. They haven't invited me to become part of the Federal Reserve System. So
no, I don't
he's
think so.
Part of that banking establishment. And no wonder, because he defended the bailouts and TARP funds and all this. So he's part of that system.
Presidential hopeful Congressman Ron Paul is pro-life. He wants to preserve family values by ending U.S. wars abroad, and he wants to restore the dollar's value. These values helped him win the recent Values Voters straw poll. This after Congressman Paul won straw polls in California and South Carolina and at the Conservative Political Action Conference earlier this year. But social conservatives like Tony Perkins from the Family Research Council scoff at Ron Paul's most recent victory, saying the real winner is businessman Herman Cain. With Congressman Paul's steady success, why are so many conservative leaders seemingly at odds with the voters? Here to discuss is Republican strategist Jack Berkman. Jack, it's a pleasure. Welcome.
Judge, good to be with you.
All right, so the essence of Ron Paul's campaign is more individual freedom and less government. That is not exactly what we have heard from the value voters, the conservative, social conservatives, who basically want the government to use its powers to induce people into a certain way of behaving with their personal lives.
Yeah, although Ron Paul, I can see what's happening, Judge, because he covers it on all fronts. You have social conservative, you have small government, it's anti-Fed, he's anti-intervention in Afghanistan. He ties together a package of things that very much appeal to social conservatives. I'm going to make a bold prediction.
Go ahead.
Ron Paul could win the GOP nomination. A lot of people are going to think that's fanciful. Let's take a look at it. Perry is starting to stumble. Bachmann and Gingrich probably already out. Romney, the front runner, but I don't think it's impossible for him to win. He can't get through the South on Super Tuesday. Question becomes who's left. You have Cain surging. I don't think Cain is a neophyte, no real political experience. I don't look for that to go anywhere. Ron Paul, Rick Santorum, I could easily see Paul surging.
All right, can you see a libertarian Ron Paul appealing to social conservatives when he's in favor of legalizing drugs and legalizing prostitution?
Well,
now, these are not necessarily issues. The drugs, yes. The prostitution, no. That affect the president or the federal level.
No one is pristine. I can see Ron Paul catching on. I'm not saying I think it will happen, but I can definitely see this happening because, again, if you look at the whole range of issues and you look at who else is out there, there aren't a lot of choices.
Has the Republican Party changed over the years? Goldwater, Reagan, George W. Bush, Ron Paul. I mean, there was a time when things like end the Fed were anathema. No serious Republican would be caught saying it.
Sure.
There were times when you're not in favor of our troops. Well, I'm in favor of the troops. I'm just not in favor of putting them in harm's way for a cause that doesn't help our freedom or our safety. Was arguments you wouldn't hear from Republicans. Now you do. Even Newt Gingrich agrees with Ron Paul on the wars and not ending the Fed, but at least auditing the Fed.
The taboo is becoming reasonable. It's becoming mainstream. Well, to your first point, the party has become much more conservative. There's no question about that. And some of the things that people just whispered 20 years ago, now you can say out in the open. Fortunately, you have people saying what they believe, which is a new thing. Here's what really shocked the system, what the Fed did with AIG,
right,
which I would argue is the worst thing the U.S. government ever did to its people.
That is the
worst thing.
Would you agree with me that that event, bailing out a private insurance company from the consequences of its own bad business judgment, unifies those kids downtown? The progressives and the libertarians all agree on that.
I agree. It's bringing far left and far right together. It's bringing, as you say, progressives and libertarians, a lot of groups that wouldn't be together, lots of strange bedfellows. It's just that AIG had become a house of bookies. It was a horrifying thing.
Right.
You have just one group of bankers washing the hands of the other group of bankers. It was terrible. Bernanke knew not to do that. It was a horrid abuse of power. And then followed up with TARP, which was almost as bad. But I think AIG really shocked the system. And that's why you have all the anti-Fed talk.
I don't mind criticizing, you know, the wealthy at times, and I criticize the bankers and the bailouts and the corporate people who got all the benefits, both when the financial bubble was being built, but then when it burst, they got bailed out. And then the people suffered. So, but this doesn't mean that we should attack wealth for the sake of wealth. We should stop all the subsidies to the wealth. Anybody's getting wealthy because they get contracts from the government or because they're on the inside of the program where they get the bailouts. That's quite a bit difference. We should stop that, but not blanketly penalize people who make wealth and who have created wealth and provided great services for the consumer.
That seems to be a line that you hear from a lot of those demonstrators, the Occupy Wall Street demonstrators in Lower Manhattan right now. What do you make of those demonstrations?
Well, it's hard to tell because we don't know where they're coming from, and I think it is going to be a mixed bag, and this is something I've predicted for many years, because I said that what would happen is eventually we would destroy our economy, jobs would go overseas, we would have inflation, and we've encouraged people to be very dependent. Both the wealthy and the entitlement system means that people believe they have rights to certain things from their neighbor or from their government. But when the pie shrinks, there's going to be a lot of anger. So my guess would be that there's a lot of people out there, some complaining about paying the bills and some who are scared to death they're not going to get it. But this is, you know, a symptomatic thing that we're seeing. It doesn't address the problem. Why do we have business booms, and why do we have recessions and depressions, and why do we have inflation? So unfortunately, this doesn't give us the answer, but I think it tells you something about the depth of the concern about the people in this country, something that I've tried to talk about for quite a few decades.
I asked, I spoke with a whole bunch of people about this issue, this Occupy Wall Street demonstrations, but I want you to listen to what one of your presidential rivals, Herman Cain, told the Wall Street Journal about what's going on with these demonstrators in New York. Listen to this.
I don't have facts to back this up, but I happen to believe that these demonstrations are planned and orchestrated to distract from the failed policies of the Obama administration. Don't blame Wall Street. Don't blame the big banks. If you don't have a job and you're not rich, blame yourself.
You don't blame yourself, he said. What do you think about that?
Well, I imagine that applies to a few people in the country, but no, I don't quite come at it that way because the system has been biased against the middle class and the poor. When you destroy a currency, you transfer wealth from the middle class to the wealthy because they have access to the capital and they have a lot of benefits and they get the bailouts. So the poor and the people losing their jobs, it wasn't their fault that we have followed a very deeply flawed economic system. So I am not so anxious to say, yeah, it's all your fault. If you want to be rich, you can be rich. People are begging and pleading for jobs, but there are no jobs as a consequence of bad economic policy. It's the fact that we have still accepted the notion that central economic planning and central banking under the Keynesian model can provide prosperity. That's where the flaw is. But to blame that on the average person who wants a job, I don't agree with that. I see all the other candidates sort of in one group that is, and they're all different than what I'm talking about because the foreign policy I advocate, neither one of them do, and the Federal Reserve have a tremendous emphasis on that, and I have a tremendous emphasis on personal liberty, the right to life and liberty, and civil liberties. So I put all the other candidates in another category, and I think in many ways are competing with all of them as one group.
The fact is, Congressman Paul's wrong about the law. He's wrong about the Constitution. And the president was exactly right legally, and he was exactly right morally in killing somebody who was a threat to everybody.
All right, so go ahead and respond to Newt Gingrich.
I'd ask him to read the Fifth Amendment. It's pretty clear that you can't take a life without due process of law, especially of an American citizen. So I would say that he's way off base. This is historic. We've never had a policy that said that we can put somebody on an assassination list by a secret tribunal, so to speak. We don't even know what the qualification is or the criteria to put somebody on this list. I think this is a most dangerous precedent, and respect for the Constitution, the rule of law, needs to be looked at because I think we have lost a lot of it. I consider this one of the most dangerous things that we have done, and this president has done it in the opening. He announced this policy in February of last year. I gave a speech on the House floor shortly thereafter, advising how dangerous this was. And this means that we have very much violated the whole concept of the rule of law.
Because Newt Gingrich, in defending the president's decision, says Anwar al-Awlaki was an enemy combatant of the United States, and over all the years of warfare, the U.S. has been able to kill so-called enemy combatants. So what do you make of that argument?
Well, I would ask him and the president to produce some evidence of exactly what he did and why is he an enemy, what are the charges. And, you know, if we can try Adolf Eichmann, the Israelis tried him in 1961, don't you think we could try somebody like al-Awlaki, or at least, you know, recognize that individuals should be captured when possible and tried? But this enemy combatant, anybody can, you know, the word I think has already been used is that he was a threat. I think Gingrich used that word, a threat. Well, I'm anti-war, and I might go to an anti-war rally, and what if the administration said, Ron Paul is a threat? Somebody in the media, he's a threat. He's preaching that the government is doing wrong with the foreign policy. This, to me, is a very, very dangerous precedent.
So would you support articles of impeachment against President Obama for this decision?
I haven't introduced them, but I think it's an impeachable offense. If the mood of the country was such that they wanted to do it, yes, I could support that.
It might surprise a lot of people watching us to know that there's another group of young people who support you overwhelmingly, and those are members of the United States military. In fact, there was recently an editorial called "You Want Him," and this was in a military newspaper, and the hymn was referring to you. And in this editorial, it reflected that you get a larger percentage of political contributions from active duty and retired military than the other Republican candidates combined. How can that be? Are they telling us something?
I think their lives are on the line, and they've been ripped off. They've been sent over. You know, I was in the active military, then I was in the Guard.
Right.
But the Guard is supposed to guard us. Reserves are supposed to be there in case we were attacked. But now, you know, the services are so worn down, they send some of these Guard units and Reserve units overseas. They're worn out. And just think of nobody talks about the cost in human life. You know, 8,000 Americans have died in these wars that are illegal and, you know, not declared. 40,000 severe injuries. And all I do is talk about, look, if we need to defend this country, we do. I tried my best when I was in the military. Right. But we just can't continue to do that. I think the military liked the idea of somebody being cautious. I certainly was looking for somebody cautious in 1965 when LBJ escalated the Vietnam War. Right. I wasn't all that happy about that. So I can identify with why active military people are sympathetic to what I'm saying.
As wrong as it was for George W. Bush to have invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, wasn't that evil compounded by paying for it on a credit card? Stated differently, in a year or so, we'll be gone. We'll still owe $2 trillion for a war that will have been history and will not have made us any freer or any safer.
Yeah, first they went into war the wrong way. The war wasn't necessary for our national security, and what you mentioned is paying for it. But history is pretty accurate in that most wars are paid for through debasement of the currency. You know, that has been, inflating the currency. So that is pretty traditional. So that's why you should be absolutely cautious about going to war, because it has economic consequences.
How fearful are you about debasement of the currency? The great empires throughout history, which America aspires to be, wrongfully in your view and in mine, have collapsed when their dollars weren't worth anything, when people couldn't even buy food with the amount of money they had in their pockets or their banks or under their beds.
Hundreds and hundreds of times in my lifetime, you know, I could name a dozen countries that have gone through this. So it always happens. And this whole idea, what I'm surprised is how aggressively people defend paper. Like, paper is saintly. You mean you would attack the Federal Reserve and the paper standard? But most of those people have benefits that they're going to derive. You know, you might be on the receiving end of those funds in the military-industrial complex or on the entitlement system, so they don't want those funds to be cut off.
But do you think that if we keep up as we're doing, if the Fed continues to print money, if the government continues to spend trillions that it doesn't have, that our currency eventually will become so debased and a loaf of bread might cost $100?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just think what's happened since 1971. gold was $35 an ounce. The dollar continually is debased. The big question is it going to totally destroy and go to zero, which would be really a tragedy? I hope we come to our senses and that we say, we better cut back and come home, and we better, live within our means. So I think we should work for it, but we better be prepared for runaway current, inflation. And that's a lot worse than what we've just gone through financially. It's much, much more serious.
Your ideas and articulation of them have caught fire amongst young people, and even people my age, throughout the country.
Yeah, I think so, and I think some of them worry about it. Maybe they don't want us to get that message out too strongly, but so they're sort of trying to water it down, and they take the message. That's not an unknown thing in history. Water down a message and take hold of it and say, I'm attacking the Federal Reserve, or something like that, but they don't really believe it.
We've seen a little of that from some of your opponents who said, we favor auditing the Fed. They didn't say that 4 years ago.
Well, that's a good sign, and some of them are saying, well, maybe it's time we ought to think about bringing those troops home from Afghanistan. Yeah, it's about time we started thinking about that.
I suggest you watch the debate, and as you do, look for this. Who among them is the most consistent defender of human freedom? Who among them is the most trustworthy custodian of your tax dollars? Who among them will return free to free enterprise? Who among them is the most faithful to the Constitution? The answer will be obvious.